Hello, and welcome to the June 6, 2018 edition of the Cluster API breakout meeting for SIG Cluster Lifecycle. Today, we're going to start off with a Karan agenda item for deleting code. Yay! Karan, you want to take it away?
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. We got a bunch of thumbs up. So good news is clusterctl is now in a stable state where it can create clusters on both vSphere and GCP. That meets our criteria for deleting GCP deployer, TF deployer, and vSphere deployer. I should add that here.
Can we add a link too?
Sorry, a link to the bug is
A link to clusterctl in general?
Oh, sure, I'll add that. And so the only feature parity missing is deleting a cluster, but we do have PRs out for documentation for how to delete a cluster. Both deleting nodes in vSphere and GCP are supported programmatically, so it's basically two steps where you delete nodes and then you delete your master VM. Yeah, and I think Megan has a script for deleting GCP service accounts that are created as part of deploying a cluster. So it's pretty much automated, not completely, but I think we're in a happy state right now. The plan, as far as deletion actually goes, I have the PR out. It's on hold. I'll probably submit it end of day today, early tomorrow, because I want to give people a little bit of time to, I don't know, shift over their code if they're working on something to clusterctl. And that's pretty much it as far as deletion goes.
So Karan sort of stated the plan of record. Are there any thoughts, questions, objections to deleting the provider-specific directories? I mean, unless there are objections, the plan is to do that in pretty short order.
Sorry, I'm looking at the code base now. Where's the new provider code going to live? Are those in new repos or are those just in the clusterctl directory?
The new provider code is not being moved at all. The provider code is not being moved at all. Okay. The only thing that will change is the tool. Instead of having a tool per provider, you'll use the common clusterctl tool. I think the question of where the provider goes is a little bit orthogonal. When I think this makes it easier for us to decouple the providers from cluster API repo itself. Now we have one place to update it rather than 3 or 4.
Okay, yeah, +1 sounds good to me on deleting the other stuff.
Anyone else has opinions, objections, comments?
All right, let's keep moving. If people have comments, we can add them into the chat and come back. In the meantime, you've got the next agenda item also.
I do have the next one. So since clusterctl is it can create clusters, and we feel like it's ready to get some real world usage. I was just exploring ideas for how we can build and release candidates. Probably like a 001 alpha.0 or alpha.1 or something, just so we can get the balls rolling. I don't really know what the process for building and releasing Kubernetes or SIG assets are. What I think we could do with guidance from everyone else is build Linux AMD64 and Darwin AMD64 binaries, tag them, and put them up as releases on GitHub. Again, the process-wise, I'm not sure, and I'm looking for input here.
Chris, I was going to say, do you want to give any background about how COPS does releases? Because I think this project is in a similar state as COPS, as we're decoupled from the sort of the main Kubernetes release train. I know there's a lot of machinery built around the main Kubernetes release train, and kubeadmin sort of jumped on that boat. But I think it'd be nice for us to stay decoupled, and maybe you can give a little background about what COPS does and things that are good or bad about that process. If you
Yeah, totally. So last I was super involved with COPS was months ago, and the way that our release worked is we did a best effort to follow on the coattails of the Kubernetes release, and we tried to at least follow the same semantic versioning as closely as possible. So where Kubernetes would release, 5.4, or I'm sorry, 1.54, we would shortly, like 2 or 3 weeks later, release a COPS correspondent as well that would support the new Kubernetes code base with any changes as needed. One downside to that is it wasn't always as quick as we thought it was going to be. In some cases, it was almost no work, and in some cases, it was a very large amount of work. So it was hard to find like a stable pattern there. I would just high level want to bring up like why do we think it's a good idea to stay decoupled from the release cycle here? I know when we were first talking about this, Justin and Tim and a few other folks really were pushing towards making this like a more mainstream thing, and I think getting into the main release cycle would be helpful here, but don't want to over-engineer anything.
Right. Yeah, I think we can tie in with the Kubernetes versions. Actually, although I don't know if we should start with 1.10.4 now, clusterctl version 1.10.4, because what I'm thinking is maybe clusterctl could be completely independent and start out itself as 0.0.1. I'm not really sure how COPS was implemented and how tied in it is with Kubernetes versions, but this tool itself does not really have any tie-in with specific Kubernetes versions. That's all part of the specs and the YAMLs and the config maps. And so following the Kubernetes train would mean either we get to do too few or too many releases than we need. Because once clusterctl is in a stable state where it can create arbitrary clusters on any supported platform, we pretty much need to update a config map to support the new Kubernetes version, aka the startup scripts, test it, and then release the YAMLs rather than release clusterctl again. Does that make sense?
It does. I would want to I'm going to kind of play devil's advocate here, push back on that just a little bit. The reason behind that is, again, like I mentioned earlier, just being part of core. And even if we aren't really releasing any changes whatsoever, getting into a release cadence that allows us to release quickly is going to be important here. And at least that gives folks an easy way to know if they're running the most recent version of our code or not having to go through a different mental exercise to make sure that they're running the most updated version. One proposed thing we could try here, and we talked about doing this in COPS, was doing a best effort to release at the same time, just to see if it was like, what are the pros and cons, and is it even feasible for us? Is this something that is worth the effort? And if it looks like it's a fairly easy process, then keep up with it, and if not, pull back and then start to do our own releases.
Yeah, I think this is a great discussion, and we probably won't be able to wrap it up completely today. I think we should maybe branch into like what should we do in the short term if we think we have something we want people to start testing, or they can test like something that was built rather than building it themselves from head. And then also the long-term sort of strategic question of how we want to do releases in general. I mean, I think kubeadmin right now is part of the Kubernetes release cycle. And that definitely has some downsides too, because if you don't quite squeeze everything in before Kubernetes cuts its release, then you have bugs and you're trying to convince Kubernetes to cut a new release just to fix one of your bugs, which is really frustrating and is becoming more difficult over time. Like I think there was like like a 1.8.0 was cut and kubeadmin was broken, and we had to cut a 1.8.1 very quickly afterwards.
Yeah, that was at KubeCon a while ago.
Yeah, and so and the other thing you mentioned, I feel like you mentioned two things that were a little bit at odds. One is tying into the primary release process, and the other was releasing with a fast cadence. And in my mind, releasing every 3 months is not a particularly fast cadence, especially during the early part of the process, early part of the development process. Like right now, if we had to wait 3 months to cut our first release, that seems kind of crazy.
Okay. Is it possible, and I don't know, like this might be a steering committee question, but is it possible to have an arbitrary release number that makes it into a Kubernetes release, just whichever one is our most recent, that's the one that gets bundled into the release at that time.
I mean, that's kind of what we do with things like the ingress controller and other sort of add-ons, right? We have that like add-ons manifest directory in the cluster directory in Kubernetes, which is deprecated and everybody wants to get rid of. But that's effectively what that directory does, is it basically has external references to things that were built elsewhere and says, this is the version of that thing you should use with this Kubernetes release. In some ways, I feel like we might have the opposite problem, where what we want to do is we want to say, this version of clusterctl supports the following versions of Kubernetes, not this version of Kubernetes requires this specific build of clusterctl. Because I feel like we want to be a little bit more permissive in terms of being able to support multiple versions and upgrades and downgrades and so forth.
Okay.
I don't know. I do feel like this is a really interesting conversation that we probably want to keep having. But I do want to also answer Karan's question about sort of short-term tactically. Are people okay with us, tagging the repo, building a binary, probably through some manual process, and pushing that binary up to the GitHub releases page, so people can start playing with something that's been pre-built as opposed to having to build it themselves?
Yeah, I'm fine with that.
On the point of compatibility for clusterctl, won't that be in part determined by the provider implementation? So that's something to keep in mind.
A little bit, yes. So right now, actually, that's a good point. Right now in GCP, we support the machine setup config map, which means you can have arbitrary startup scripts and support arbitrary versions. These where we don't yet. And so I think this is why my point of not tying in with Kubernetes just yet comes in, because yeah, clusterctl should be independent of the Kubernetes version. It does depend on the provider.
Okay. I think it's a good idea to just start a release now, and then maybe I can take on opening a broader release cycle GitHub issue for us to banter on moving forward.
Yeah, I'd love to also bring Phil Wittrock into that conversation, because he has been talking to me for quite a while about wanting to divorce kubectl from the Kubernetes release process. And he would love for kubectl to be built and released at a much, much faster cadence than every 3 months. Like I think he mentioned, weekly or bi-weekly releases of kubectl so that the client tooling could move way faster. And so it'd be really interesting to get his perspective, having been part of the main release process for a long time, and why they want to change that and how they think it would work, right? Because if, it's one of those things where if we let them do it first, then we can take all the lessons they've learned, reinvent it ourselves. But I don't know what their time frame is.
Okay.
So I guess next step could be I'll update this bug with a little bit of what we talked about, cut a release, call it alpha 1, 001, alpha 1 or something like that. Tag the repo and release it. I don't think I can do it as an admin, but I'll find someone who can.
All right. Yeah, I think Chris and I are both admins.
Okay, awesome.
And the other Chris who's not here today.
Okay. There's a chat question. Is there a quick start for clusterctl? Yes. It is in the README of cluster API/clusterctl.
Which is also, it's linked from the notes. I'll throw a link to it in the chat also, if people didn't see the link in the notes. Okay, were there any other questions, comments, concerns about cutting an initial release and starting a longer conversation about what we want to do in the medium term for release process?
One thing I wanted to bring up, and we can move this to the issue I'm starting or another one. Does it make sense to release a container image for clusterctl?
Why do you say that?
Just for folks who want to run a container for arbitrary reasons, anything from running on other operating systems to a lot of folks, especially at larger organizations, have tooling built around just pulling an image and using that on the command line.
Right. I don't particularly mind it.
The reason I bring it up is because it's a support burden, right? Like maintaining a container image is just another thing.
Yeah, that's what I was about to say is right now, because we don't have like I would rather we get clusterctl in a little bit more stable state and then start releasing images. But if someone really needs it, I think we can make a Debian-based image. Or
I'd be willing to help with that. I mean, I know that I would prefer to have a container.
okay, let's cut a bug for that as well, and I can assign that to Craig.
Okay. DWAT, can you open that?
Sure.
Rad.
Sorry if I get names mixed up. All right, I'll mute myself up then.
All right, cool. Next, SSH provider for already provisioned machines.
Yeah, I just wanted to share this with the meeting. I've got a proposal out. Thanks to everybody who's looked at it, left comments. I'm still in the process of answering them. Plan to publish the controller repo by the end of this week. And I haven't looked at integrating with clusterctl, so that might take a little longer. Robert asked a great question on the issue, with regards to how this would use machine set and machine deployment. The provider supports already provisioned machines, so a machine spec or machine object needs some information that's host specific. So there's not really a way to pass that kind of information to machine deployment to have it create the machine objects. So still thinking about that. If you haven't taken a look at the proposal, please take a look. Thank you for your feedback, and yeah, if you have any ideas or suggestions, those are very welcome. So,
where are you planning on publishing the controller repo?
It's going to be in I think under the initially maybe under the Platform 9 GitHub org. And that is, so that's the plan, because as far as I understood from the issue, once there are maintainers across a couple of companies for this provider, which hopefully will be the case soon, then we can move that into a request under maybe the Kubernetes or Kubernetes SIG org. Okay,
yeah, that's what I was asking, is because I think you'll be one of the first people to say, like, we have our separate repo with our machine controller code, our cloud provider specific code, and we don't have a great process yet for figuring out where those go or how ownership works for them. So that'll be really useful, I think, to start treading that new ground.
I actually I'm not clear on how to define the licensing. Maybe if I can ask somebody offline, maybe in Slack, if somebody can give me some hints with that.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Chris, do you know who a person we could add? I mean, do you want the licensing to be like similar or equivalent to CNCF licensing? I think that,
it needs to be, yeah. So there's a whole thing. If it's going to be an official SIG sponsored project, if that's the direction we want to take this thing in, there is a whole write-up of what you need. You have to have a CLA in place, CNCF CLA. You need an Apache 2 license. There's a checklist of things you can do. And then we, as a SIG, adopt that or whatever.
And can you put all those things in place on the repo while it's still under the Platform 9 org, and that would make it easier to transition? Is that the idea?
Yes, and then the only caveat here is, and this is what the folks in Virtual Kubelet are fighting right now, is if you started with a non-Apache 2 license, it's a total nightmare, because you have to do the whole, reach out to everyone, get written approval that they're willing to move from other license to Apache 2, and then transition their commits and blah, 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 blah. So if it's not Apache 2, that should be the first thing you do, is get it to Apache 2.
Okay, I assume the CLA thing would be a similar problem. Like if you wanted to adopt it, you'd have to go make sure everybody who put a commit into that repo had signed the CLA, and it's easier to do that ahead of, as the commits are coming in, than to have to do it retroactively.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
I know we have a CLA bot on all the Kubernetes repos. Do you know if it's possible to point the existing CNCF CLA bot at a non-Kubernetes repo, or is that something that would have to be done in a different way?
That's a great question. We should probably email Kubernetes dev on that one.
It's possible. You can do it.
Oh, it is? Right.
All right. Thanks, Dims. That is super useful, because I think this is going to become a more common question. I know Joe Beta has been of the opinion that we should not have to do all of our development in the Kubernetes GitHub repos, right? And I know that Heptio has been building their own stuff, and if that stuff wants to get contributed later, like, it's really useful to be able to take all this tooling and apply it. And I think Brendan's going to talk about this also, that was sent around, like the associated repos and everything.
Yeah.
Sweet. Excellent. So hopefully that answers your questions, Daniel, and gives you a good path forward.
Thanks.
And it sounds like if you have questions about the CLA bot, you should go ask Dims.
This might make for a good blog article. I might try to knock something out in the next week or two, just that has all the info we need.
Awesome. That would be great. Right. So next we have the follow-up discussion from last week about multiple clusters in a single namespace with a link to a pull request. I know there was also an issue about this as well, or a couple of issues. So I guess,
yeah. So last week, I'll run with it. Last week we had a fairly lengthy discussion around making an explicit association between machine and clusters that they're a part of. And one of the aspects of that was that in an earlier issue, we had agreed that there would be a one-to-one relationship between cluster and namespace. And we're wondering if there are objections to relaxing that restriction and allowing multiple clusters to exist in a single namespace. Like, we wanted to bring that to a larger audience to make sure that whoever was missing last week could speak up and say whether there are objections and what those objections might be.
and I guess the other sort of half of that is once you put multiple clusters in the same namespace, then it becomes unclear in the current API design which machines in that namespace belong to which cluster in that namespace. And so that's sort of the follow-on part of this conversation, is how to more tightly link machines and clusters together if they're all in the same namespace.
Yes, and the PR that's linked in the meeting notes there is an implementation that would add a local object reference to the machine spec that would link to the cluster that machine set, machine deployment would be associated with.
So I put into the meeting notes, but one question I had is I was reading through the Gardener architecture, which I linked to here. And what they do, it looks like, and maybe Martin can correct me if I'm wrong, is it says that when they are creating these clusters, the machine definitions, the machine CRDs, are put not into the same namespace as the cluster in what they call their garden cluster, but they're actually put into the shoot cluster, I believe, if I'm getting the terminology right. And so that's a sort of a different approach of how to do this. So you could, in your garden cluster, have 5 different clusters in the same namespace, but all the machines for those clusters wouldn't be confusing which one was which, because the machines would live in the shoot cluster. And so to figure out which machines are with which cluster, from the top level, you'd go down to the shoot cluster and just look at the machines. And from the shoot cluster, you'd go up to the garden cluster and find the cluster that's associated with it. Am I describing that right?
Yeah, so our approach is, so we have like a specification for the machines, but it's like a template, but more or less like one very huge specification for cluster. And based on this specification, we create the machines, but the users don't have access to those machines because we want to manage them and operate them. And because of that, we are putting our machine controller for now, and hopefully the cluster API soon, next to the API server, but end users don't have access to it yet. So this is our approach. And because the API server, the etcd, the machine controller, and all those different resources running in a separate namespace, we can isolate them very good, and yeah, it's much better.
So do you guys put multiple clusters into the same namespace, or do you have one?
Yes, exactly.
So what I put in the chat and what I'm wondering here is, it seems like there's sort of at least two different proposals for how to deal with multiple clusters in the same namespace. One is to have both the clusters and the machines in the same namespace in the same cluster, and the other is to have the cluster and the machines the clusters in the same namespace, but the machines be differentiated because they are in a different cluster. If I'm understanding the Gardner architecture correctly.
I mean, yeah. So our approach is so we don't. So at the end, the actual control plane of every single cluster, it's in on namespace. So this is the end result. So in this same namespace, we also create the machines.
So do the machine specs live in the Garden cluster or the Shoot cluster?
It's actually in the third cluster, which is actually the ones that host the control planes for every single cluster. Yeah.
Okay.
But at the end, the control plane for every single every single cluster, yeah, they live in the namespace, and inside of in this namespace we have the machines.
I guess the key distinction I'm trying to get at is, do you talk to the same Kubernetes endpoint if you're looking at the cluster spec and the machine specs, or are those at two different Kubernetes endpoints?
They can be the same, but in our use case, at least for us, they're different, but they can be the same. So it depends on what your architecture is.
Okay, right, but but in your architecture right now, they're different. So I guess what I'm worried about is, if we put an owner ref, say, on machines to cluster, then that wouldn't work for the way that the current Garden architecture is, because if they're in different Kubernetes API servers, there's no way to strongly link them with an owner ref. And if that's a required field on machines, then it would be impossible to create machines if you didn't have that cluster definition in that same Kubernetes instance.
Yeah. Unless you copy them, but it's or the specification for the cluster, it's, I don't know, or have some garbage collection.
So what's the approach that you're taking right now? So you use your own custom machine controller. So
yeah,
with the
current
current cluster API machine controller, there's a requirement that there's a cluster in the namespace.
So maybe I'll so hi, this is Hardik. So I'll try to put the architecture in a slightly different way. So I could see, I think there were a few confusions. So there are actually three different layers of the clusters, right? So first layer is called the Garden cluster. Second layer is called a seed cluster, and the third layer is called the shoot clusters, right? And in the Garden cluster, you can see it in a way that there is one namespace where we run something called Gardener Controller Manager. So Gardener Controller Manager is something that in our case would be a controller, which is basically a controller for the cluster API, the highest level of controller, right? And in that Garden cluster, we will have a namespace where we will, in the single namespace, we will register different clusters there. So it could be a cluster 1.yaml, cluster 2.yaml, and all of them would be in a they can be in a single namespace inside the Garden cluster. But what really happens is that the controller manager, the Gardener controller manager, which is running in the Garden cluster, right? So it basically reads the cluster 1.yaml, and then inside the seed cluster, it dedicates only one namespace for that one cluster. So it's basically when cluster 1.yaml is introduced inside the seed cluster, one namespace will be created. Let's call it cluster 1 inside the seed cluster. And inside that namespace, the control plane of that cluster 1 will be installed. And then the actual worker machines would be running as the actual worker machines are then called the shoot cluster. So there are three different layers of the cluster.
Okay, I was trying to take notes on that. So in the seed cluster for cluster 1, does that seed cluster, could it also contain cluster 2, which would be in a different namespace, even though they're in the same namespace in the Garden cluster?
Yeah, so in the seed cluster, one namespace actually maps to the one shoot cluster. And shoot cluster is something that's the end user cluster that we finally consume. So inside the seed cluster, one namespace maps to the one cluster, and each namespace basically holds the control plane of the shoot cluster. You can see it in that way. So basically, if I understand correctly, right, so the conversation that we had from the Matthews was about that if we want to put two different control planes inside the single namespace of the seed cluster, right? So that's something that we have tried to avoid. So because then it will end up in the same set of questions that you have, that how to identify that which machine belong to which namespace and so on. But I'm really curious that what could be the use case here. So if I want to have a single namespace for multiple different clusters, I'm just curious that what could be the use case?
Our main use case at Red Hat is that we're managing remote clusters, and there may be a user that just wants to have one set of credentials that they store in secrets. So rather than having to copy those credentials to every namespace for every cluster that they want to create, they would have one namespace that has one set of credentials, and each cluster would share that secret.
But can you put on a reference? A reference to that different namespace, to that secret? If they're in the same API server, that it shouldn't be a problem to have a reference to that secret.
Can you pod use a secret that's in a different namespace from itself? I don't know if that's possible.
I don't think it is. Pods shouldn't have access outside of their namespace to maybe read only, but they should be able to mutate it.
Well, read only would be fine for the secret, right? Because the pod wouldn't be mutating it. It's a question of whether you can create a pod that loads a secret from a different namespace.
No, you cannot. But your controller, if actually, I mean, so what kind of credentials do you store there?
The credentials for AWS.
Doesn't this depend on what the role is for the service account? Whether you can access a secret in a different namespace? I mean, I think it's just how you configure the cluster. Or I don't understand.
Well, at least for pods, there's no way to specify which namespace to pull a secret from. And presumably, I mean, to do that, you'd still have to specify which namespace you're pulling the secret from. I mean, I think the other broader use case, though, is RBAC, just general RBAC. Like now.
Can anybody else hear Craig? He cut out for me.
Oh, sorry, I hit mute by accident.
Okay, yeah, you said the general case is RBAC, and then I didn't hear anything else.
The general case for RBAC, though, like if we were to start to mix and match secrets from one namespace to another, I think you start to bleed the lines around where RBAC lines of distinction are, right? It would be, well, I guess what I'm saying is it'd be kind of awkward for me to say, like, okay, I'm going to pull in a secret, and the secret comes from namespace foo.
So Martin or Hardik, maybe you guys could describe in the SAP model how you deal, because I think your architecture deals with a similar concern where you have one user that wants to create multiple clusters using the same credentials. So how does that work in the Garden architecture?
Yeah. Can I explain? So because of our use case and because we have some quota, so we have a secret that can be shared between multiple clusters. So for example, if a manager gives access to different teams under him, so we create a credential, a secret, and then we have another object which is more or less a secret binding that allows, which basically specifies. I mean, it's mainly for RBAC because we don't want to have because if you reference a secret in your controller, then you have to be sure that the user who is actually creating those or trying to reference these secrets has an RBAC rule. So we have a secret binding, and our controller reads this secret, and then it copies it into the namespace of the control plane that we create, pretty much. So this is our logic.
Okay, so the secret is stored in the Garden cluster by the manager, and if they give access to someone to create a shoot cluster, then the Garden controller creates a namespace in the shoot cluster, copies a secret in that namespace and starts the controller point at that secret so that it can actually actuate on AWS
Yeah,
or
exactly.
whatever
I mean,
else.
yeah, more or less. Otherwise, if you're running multiple clusters, there is no way. I mean, in our use case, even our cluster is behind firewall, so it cannot be accessed by the seed cluster. So it should be the other way around, unfortunately.
Yes. So essentially, yes, in the seed cluster, the secrets for different namespace will be replicated. But then it's interesting question that we anyway have to make sure that the access of the seed cluster, or if some root cluster or anything, it's different in other use cases, right? So we anyway have to make sure that no one gets access of this layer, right? Then is it really a, so I'm just trying to thinking out loud, that is it really a concern to replicate the secret on multiple namespace? Because we anyway have to make sure that even for the one namespace, we will somehow not leak the access, right? And at least in the Gardener, we put this responsibility on the higher level cluster. That's a garden cluster. So on the garden cluster, user gives the secret only once, and then you can have a terminology like a project. So if you have created, let's say, a project 1, and then the admin of that project will say that I can add 10 different developers. So if 10 different developers are added, then only those set of guys will have access to, they will be able to see the only the ID of the secret, basically. And the actual secret will be then for the shoot clusters, actual secret will be then actually be installed in the seed clusters namespaces. So, but this is interesting use case. I never thought about it.
Yeah, one question I would have about that is like secret rotation. So if you have one secret that's shared, it's relatively easy to rotate that secret because you change to one secret and there's no propagation. Do you guys do secret rotation for the Gardener, or have you thought about how that would work?
I mean, are you talking about credentials or the secret only for the S?
So like an AWS credential.
I mean, so our current architecture is pretty much so whenever you update a secret, so it will be in the next reconciliation, it will be redistributed all around currently. And there are no operations in the meantime that operate on this secret, so it's safe, I think, for now.
Okay, so the procedure would be you'd update the secret in the Garden cluster. The Garden controller would then go update it in each of the shoot clusters where the machine controllers in those clusters or the other controllers would reread that secret and start using it.
If you go back to the original, why we do one control plane per namespace, because it's easier to delete it. It's very easier to delete it, and you're sure that you only delete the resources that are for this cluster. And this is one very big deal. Otherwise, it's very nasty to. I mean, because if you try to delete it manually, there certainly will be some resources that or third-party resources that will be not. I mean, that you have to know about those. So in most cases, it's easier simply to delete the namespace.
So you guys delete the namespace and then let the namespace finalizers take care of deleting all of the resources under this.
Yeah, but yeah, we do some other things before that, but pretty much, yeah.
But in a nutshell, right? Okay. So I guess my point of poking this discussion was that I think it would be nice if we had a single or a sort of a small number of designs that we think are maybe like sort of the best way to do this, that we could promote and have the API sort of have sort of suggestions of like, maybe this is the way that we think is the right way to do it. And there are at least sort of two options on the table here. So I wanted to explore sort of the rationales for starting to build these two different options and see if there's a way that we can sort of merge them towards each other and have some agreement on what would make sense. So I'm not sure we're going to get that answer right now, but I think it's definitely worth exploring. So I guess the one big thing would be, I think the relationship between machines and clusters is fine. I do worry that having a strong reference, like with an owner ref, is going to break some use cases. Anybody else have thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I still haven't heard a use case that would break because of having the strong reference. I mean, I understand that it's not needed and it's just an additional thing that would have to be added to the spec and filled out. But I'm not hearing my use case won't work if I have to fill it out.
So if I understand the SAP architecture correctly, basically the cluster spec would be in the garden cluster and the machine specs would be in the shoot cluster. And since those are in two different Kubernetes API servers, there's no way to make an owner reference between them, I believe.
Okay, but there's already, then we need to step back and relax the requirement that there is a namespace, is a cluster with every machine, because we certainly have that requirement now.
Yes. Do we? Does the API enforce that right now?
The API doesn't enforce it, but the machine controller does.
Interesting.
I mean, the machine controller won't sync if the cluster doesn't exist.
Yeah, the current implementation, assuming this cluster always exists for the machine. So, but that can change.
Fang, do you know offhand what it requires from the cluster to function properly?
I need to double check, but we do need to represent property in the cluster to create the machine. So, yeah.
So I'm then wondering, so if we put the strong owner reference kind of, so that's a discussion, right? That if we should put the strong owner reference kind of stuff inside the machine deployment, which points to the cluster, then what would we expect? So if somebody deletes the cluster, then eventually the related machine deployment should also be deleted, or machine set should also be deleted. Is that so?
But the proposal is not an owner reference; it's just a local reference.
Oh, okay. No, the local reference should be fine, I guess. Owner reference, I was just wondering if it's owner reference, and it would be not so good. But yeah, normal reference should be fine.
Yeah, there was a side topic last week where we talked about whether machines created from a machine spec should the machine set controller should be able to create the machines prior to the cluster existing, and whether subsequently when the cluster is deleted, the machines that are created by the machine set should be deleted as well. But I think that's for a later date if we want to bring that up again, and not needed strictly by any work that would put a local object reference in.
For the dependency with cluster, I think it's mostly the control plane information, like the network, the port or service IP address range. This kind of information, it's for example required in the GCE controller for set up the machine metadata. So that's why in the implementation, the machine was trying to reference cluster.
So that actually brings to a nice question. So what the philosophy that we have tried to imply is more or less that there should be, right? So for example, if there are a set of machines, then who should be able to work on the set of machines or put the actions? They should ideally be only the machine set to avoid complete race conditions, right? In a similar way, machine deployment should only talk to the machine set. It should not really mess with the actual machine object. And that gives us kind of a relaxation from the race conditions that if somebody else tries to delete the machine object and machine set gets confused and so on. So in a similar way, if we have one layer above of the cluster, so I was expecting that cluster, whatever cluster controller or whatever should basically try to consume the machine deployment from the higher level and expect that the lower level stuff will then be taken care of. So if you have a machine deployment, then eventually you should delete the machine deployment, and we should make sure that machine deployment will eventually take care of the machine set and actual machines deletions. So from the higher level, we try to delete the machines, and for some reason machine set controller gets confused in between, then it will try to undo the stuff and things can go. I'm just thinking out loud. So
Hardik, are you saying that you feel like a cluster controller should own the machine deployments for that cluster? So that if you, is that what you're trying to say?
yes, so I'm just trying to say that there should be a clear separation of the responsibilities. So the higher level controller should basically talk only the one step lower layer controller. So cluster controller should only see the machine deployment and somehow try to machine deployment. And then machine deployment should somehow talk only to machine set and not really worry about the real machine objects. Though the status field and so on will be updated, but those updates will basically come from the machine set. And machine set should be the only controller which really tries to delete or create the actual machine objects. So that's only one controller which deals with the machines. In a similar way, one more layer down, where machine is the only controller which talks to the cloud provider. No one else should ever talk to the cloud provider. So that's something that we have tried to maintain. So if from the higher level, if from the cluster level, if it directly try to delete the machine objects, right, then this tag gets interrupted in between. So if somebody gets confused in between, then it will try to undo the stuff.
So I think, Hardik, either you or Martin said that you didn't think that a local reference would cause problems in your existing architecture. I would like if we could confirm that before we merge the API change, because as I said before, it's much easier to add API changes later than to take them out. And I wouldn't want to put something in that would prevent you guys from converging with the cluster API.
I mean, if it's not required field, then it's okay, I think.
I think right now it's a required field. I see validation that says if it's empty, we say new error required field. Maybe you guys could look at the PR and see. I'm sorry, Matt, to put you off another week, but I just as I was looking through it and trying to reconcile my head with the Gardener architecture, it occurred to me that it might be incompatible, and I think maybe that's okay. I mean, I think that we need to just be very careful about making sure we aren't closing doors that we don't want to close. And I guess I would also put to you to maybe take a look at the Garden architecture and see if the way that they're representing machines and clusters would make sense for what you're trying to build, either instead of or sort of as an alternative to the way you're proposing to do it right now. Would that be possible?
Yeah. We have a nice meeting with them on Monday. We can discuss it together.
Yeah, that would be great.
So we will check out the PR and see, as you say.
Perfect. Yeah, I think if we could kind of put people on sort of the same page about how we want to deal with multiple clusters in a namespace, that would be really helpful. And then Chris, you asked in chat about some reading we could do if this was confusing to people. I linked 3 issues there that I'd had open in my Chrome tabs that I've been trying to read to catch up. And there's also the PR that's linked in the meeting notes. So I'll go ahead and link all of those issues into the meeting notes as well, if people are reading this. Oh, or maybe
I put those 3 issues are at the very top.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Yeah, so if people are trying to figure out sort of where this conversation is coming from, the 3 issues are linked in the meeting notes there. And then hopefully, I think I might have said this last week, but hopefully we can come back in a week and have a little bit more consensus on how this would work. Okay, that was the end of the agenda. We have about 6 minutes left. Is there anything that popped up during the meeting that people wanted to keep discussing?
I opened that issue, so folks feel free to go and comment as they see fit.
Thank you. All right, and then Karan's got a couple of follow-on action items from his 2 points at the beginning also about deleting some code and seeing how it goes to try and build a release, which should be interesting. So I guess that's it for today. Everyone, please follow up on issues if there are things that you care about or are interested, and we will reconvene next week at the same time. Thanks so much for coming.
Okay, bye everybody.
Bye.